In the last video we created this template, as well as a whole bunch of other templates for different sections of our website. Because we're going to be programming this website to be dynamic, we don't want to have the same code in multiple places. For example, if we decided we wanted to change the name of the league to something other than Stretch League, we don't want to have to go through each and every single page to make that change, because we would inevitably forget one of them. In terms of the code that we want to write, we also want to make it robust enough that it can be reused under multiple circumstances, but also relative to the actual context of the page that we're rendering at the time. So to do this, we're going to create a very simple MVC framework. An MVC framework is just a way of organizing our code, which will hopefully allow us to achieve these objectives. If we were making this website for commercial purposes, we would probably use an actual popular and properly developed MVC framework, but for the sake of this tutorial we're just going to create our own. So the very first thing that we're going to do to create our framework is to move all of the templates that we've created into a new file, so that they're out of the way, but so that we can still reference them if we need to. We're just going to create a folder called Templates, and move all of the templates that we've created so far into this new folder. We're then going to go ahead and create a new index.php file. And we're actually going to need to create a .htaccess file as well, so that we can create a customized environment which will allow us to redirect our users around, instead of relying on a rigid file structure. So in our terminal window, we're just going to type touch.htaccess, which is going to create a new file for us. If we come back across the NetBeans Explorer, we can see that this new file has been created. So the very first thing that we're going to do is we're going to turn the rewrite engine on within Apache. We're then going to create a rewrite condition, followed by a regular expression. This exclamation point -d at the end means that the rewrite condition will be triggered if the target file within the URL that the user types is a directory, but it's not found. We're going to rewrite the actual directory for the user. If the directory is found, we're going to allow the user to access that directory as intended. We're also going to do this for files and links. If not, we will actually rewrite the URL. So we're going to have another regular expression, which is just So what this is going to do is it's going to identify everything after the root of the path, which will be the website's address, for example. So in our case that would be workspace, but it could be whichever URL or website address that you want to use. I'm just going to take everything that's after that and append it, which is this $1, after index.php $URL equals. And so it's just going to turn everything after the actual host name into a get variable, which is going to be passed across, and the variable's name is going to be URL. So if we save that file now and go back to our index file, so this is going to be the file which is loaded in every instance where the actual directory path doesn't exist. So what we're going to do here is we're going to first off require once config config.php. And we're going to obviously need to create this file, so we'll go ahead and do that now. New folder, config. And the new PHP file called config. Before we actually populate this, we're just going to finish off our index page. So for every page request, we're going to create a new app, which is called Bootstrap. We're also going to need to create an autoloader here so that we can actually locate this class. So to create an autoloader, we just need to type function _autoload, and then the name of the class. And then to load it, we're going to require once. And this, when we actually instantiate a new class, our MVC framework is going to try and autoload the class from the library folder. So to do that, we need to create a library folder. And because we're creating the Bootstrap class, we need to create a new PHP file called Bootstrap. If we go back to our config file, or rather our index file, we can see that we have this library here, this actual folder name. To make things easier on ourselves in the long run, we're going to actually save this path as a constant within our config file. So to create a constant, we just type const. And then in our index page, we can just replace this with our constant, which we already created. This means that if we change the name of the library folder, we can change it on the actual file structure. But then to actually implement that change, all we need to do is change it once in the library folder. And we don't need to worry about how many times we actually use the library folder within our code. Unfortunately, with the config path, we do need to include that at least once within the actual file structure. So the next thing to do is to actually populate our Bootstrap file. This is going to be a class, as we mentioned, and the class name should be identical to the file name, obviously without the .php. Whenever a new instance of this application is constructed, we want to actually run some code. So we're going to create a function called construct, and then everything that we place within this code will automatically be executed whenever this Bootstrap is instantiated. So what we're going to do within this code is we want to first check whether a URL has been provided, or rather any data has been provided after the host name of the URL. If not, we want to just redirect our users to the home page. In the case that some data has been provided, we want to validate the data. And then if the data that is provided is a relevant file path within our MVC framework, we want to redirect the user to that page. If the page doesn't exist, we want to display an error message or an error page rather. So to do this, we obviously have this URL get element which we create over here within the .htaccess file, and so we can actually use that to help us with this. So the first thing we're going to do is to create an if statement. Within this we're going to check whether the filter input of URL is set. So this is going to give us whether the data is actually set or not. If it's not set, we're going to redirect our users down here. We're then going to have our validation within this section. Because at this point we know that something has been set, we just don't know whether it's valid or not. At this point we know that nothing has been set, and so we can automatically assume that we want to go to the home page. When it comes to actually loading a page, we're going to create a new function to help us with this as well. And we're going to keep this private. And what we're going to do when we're loading a new page is we're first going to require it. And again we're going to create a new folder here in our directory structure called controllers, or controller rather. Should be a capital C. And within our config file we're going to create a new constant. And so we're going to require our controller folder, followed by the name of the file that we're going to load, which will always be of .php type. Once we've loaded the folder, we want to instantiate it. And we can instantiate a variable like this, which will obviously convert the name that we pass across into the name of the controller that we want to load. We can then go to the controller and we will have an index within here which we can load. So let's just assume that we want to throw an error message just whenever any type of input is after the host name at the moment. So to do that, all we want to do is type this, load page, and we want to throw an error. So the next thing to do is to create a library which will actually allow us to control our controller folder. So we're just going to call this controller. And because we have our autoloader, we're not going to need to do anything to actually instantiate this. And all we're going to do within this controller folder is to first off create the new class. And then whenever this is created, we're going to create a public function construct. And so this code is going to be executed whenever this controller class is constructed. And we're going to create this view equals new view, which means we also need to create a new view class. Within the controller folder, And after the construct function, we also need to load our models. So to do this, we need to create a new public function called load model, which will take a parameter of model, and then we're going to check if the file exists. Which will be in a model folder. And will always end in .php. In fact, it will always end in underscore model.php. Then we're going to require that file. So I'll just copy that across. We then obviously need to instantiate this model. And so to do this, we just create a new variable, model name. And then we're going to set this model to the new model name. Now unfortunately, because of the way PHP works, we can instantiate variables like this, but if we actually try to append to the variable and instantiate it at the same time, we won't actually be able to do so. It will just throw up an error, and so we have to save that into a variable before we instantiate that new variable. So in this section we've created a model folder which we need to add to our config file, so we'll do that now. And we've obviously created this model folder. They should both have slashes at the end. So if we create this new model folder, and we're creating an error message at the moment, so we'll create error model. And we can go through and close some of these files now. So we're going to come back to the actual bootstrap file because we need to code this validation. We're basically done with the index page now. Everything else we're going to take care of from within our actual MVC framework. The controller folder is basically done as well. And there's only one thing that we need to do within our view folder. So if we create a class called view, and then we create a public function called redirect, which takes a name as the parameter. And what we do here is this is where we actually render the pages. So we're going to require once. We're going to create one more constant called view folder, which we're going to append the header.php, which will be the top part of our page. We're going to have the actual file that we want to output, and then we're going to have the footer. And now the view file is also complete, so we can close that one. Within our controller folder, to create our error, we need to create a new PHP file called error. Don't worry if you're lost at the moment, I will walk through this exactly how it all works later on. And I've just noticed because of the autocorrect that this should be controller, not controller. So we're going to instantiate the parent in this case. which NetBeans has already populated for us. We're not going to actually change anything within this, but with other controller functions we do have the option to do this. And the one thing that we are going to do is create a public function called index. For now, all we're going to do is we're going to go this render, sorry, this view render, and we're going to call this error/index. So the next thing we're going to do is to actually create this view, as well as the header and footer views which we mentioned earlier. So we're going to create another folder. Did we create that in the config file? No, we didn't. And within here we're going to have our PHP header. We're also going to have our footer. As well as this error folder that we've just talked about. And then in this error folder we're going to have index. On this index page I'm just going to have some basic output. Just so that we can check that each of these pages is being rendered properly. So to walk you through exactly what's going to happen, we're going to go to index.php. This is going to require the config file, which is going to have all of these constants in it. We're then going to create a new instance of the bootstrap. The bootstrap is going to go ahead and it's going to try to validate whether this is going to be a page which exists or a page which doesn't exist, or we're going to pass it across to the home page. Because we've only created this load page for the error, we're going to go down here and we're going to require the controller for the error page, and we're going to create a new instance of the error, and then we're going to call the error index, which is the error index. This is going to call the render, which is inherited from the view. So if we go back to view, it's going to then render the header, the page that we pass across, and then the footer. So if we refresh our workspace again now, we're going to get an error because we're going to go to the home page and we haven't coded the automatic redirect. If we go to any other page, now I did just go ahead and try to load this page, but it turned out that there was an error, and it was because of the Htaccess file that we created. Basically there shouldn't have been a space after the comma and the L, so I've just gone ahead and corrected that. So we can see that at the moment we're getting this white screen, and we obviously wanted to have our output displayed at the moment. As we mentioned, if we have anything at all after the host name, so I'll just put the number 1 here, it should give us the rendered page that we're looking for. We've obviously got an error here though, so this is telling us that we're not able to access the render function from within the error.php and the controller file. So if we go across here, which is here, we can look to see why this isn't happening. So if we go into our controller, which this actually extends, we can see that it does actually create the view, but this page isn't valid because the load model isn't actually created. We don't have the model in our library. So if we create a new model.php, this file is going to be extremely simple. It's just going to be a model, and it's not going to have any content in it at all. We can see that we've called this redirect in the view library, but when we've actually come to try to render this page, we've called it render. So we'll rename this to render. And if we try to refresh now, we'll be able to see our header, our page body, which is coming from the error page, and then our footer. So at this point we have correctly split up our actual code, but we haven't actually finished yet. We've still got to be able to display pages other than our error page. So I'm just going to close all of these. In fact, I'm just going to wrap these in paragraphs so that they actually display on different lines. So now that we've added the P command in there, they should all show on different lines, which makes it easier to actually confirm that we're making progress, because we can see each of the individual pages rendered separately. So we're not actually going to add anything into the error model, we're going to leave this blank. In fact, when it comes to creating models for other classes, all we're going to do is to create a new class called error model. And it's just going to extend the model. So we'll just add that in there just for consistency, because that's what we're going to do for our other models. And so we come back to this part where we have our actual logic as to whether to display an error page or whether to display an actual page. So the very easiest thing that we can do to progress is to redirect our users. If they don't add any actual data after the host URL, we're just going to redirect them to the index, which we're going to be creating in a moment. So we now need to check whether the page exists that the user is trying to get to or not. To do that, we need to take the data which is passed across. I'm going to add this after the comments. And what we're going to do is we're going to save this into a variable, and we're going to basically split this up based on the position of the slashes within the data. So to do this, we're just going to explode based on slash. We're also going to trim the actual data that we're going to pass across, as well as actually filtering. And the filtering that we're going to do is the filter sanitize. Filter sanitize URL to be exact. And when it comes to the right trim, we're just going to remove the right slash. So what this is going to do is, if we have something like URL equals league slash table slash result. So the first thing we're going to do is this, the filter input, and this is actually just going to get the actual data from this input, which is specified as being a get. We're then going to filter it using the sanitize URL filter, which is going to make sure that we're not going to get any SQL injection attacks, for example. We're then going to right trim any of the last slashes, so any slash on a right we're going to delete. We're then going to explode it into an array, which is going to turn the slashes into commas and put everything inside an array. And this means URL is going to be an array from 0 to 2 in this instance. So we're then going to try and build our controller path, which will be our controller folder. the elements at the first place within our URL array, followed by .php. We're then going to have another if statement to check if the file exists. If it does exist, we're going to require that file. If it doesn't exist, this is where our error comes in. Once we've actually required this file, we also need to load it. But we're going to need to do this slightly differently to our current function. So we're actually going to create a separate function for this. We're going to pass across the URL, because we're actually going to pass across the entire URL array. The actual functionality will be similar, but because of the different approach and the different way that this is going to access its files, we need a separate function to handle it for us. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to instantiate our new controller. And we're also going to load the model for it. So the next thing that we're going to do is check whether the third and second elements are populated within our array. If they are, we're going to handle them slightly differently. So if it's set and the method exists within the controller called URL1. In this instance, we're going to call the controller, and we're actually going to escape the array, and we're going to do URL1, and then we're going to pass across as a parameter URL2. So in the example that we looked at earlier, where we had league, table and result, if the third element, result, is actually populated, we're going to try and pass that across as a parameter into our actual page within the league section. You could of course extend this to actually include all of the elements from 2 onwards, but for the purposes that we're going to be creating today, we're not going to go much beyond this. If, however, only 2 elements are passed across, so in this example we remove the result and we only have the league and the table, we want to check whether this is set first, and then if it is set, we're just going to call the controller, and again we're going to escape this array. So in this case, we would be creating the table page within the league folder. But if we didn't have that either, we just had league, we would obviously want to display the index. So we can just do controller index, and then all of this at the bottom can go, and that should be URL. So this is basically how we are able to check, based on the information which is passed across, what type of page and what level of page we should be displaying, which in turn allows us to create highly customized pages as a result of the requests from our users. Now, we've talked about this index page a lot, but we haven't actually created our main index page for the home page almost. And this will also demonstrate how easy it is to actually add new pages and new sections to our website. So what we first need to do is create a new folder in the view with the section name. We also need to create an actual PHP file with the same name, or with index at least. And this is going to be our index page for the main home page. If we wanted to have a second page within our home section, so we could have a news page, all we would need to do is create a second page within this section. So I'm just going to create a new page here. And these are the individual pages within this section. We can create as many of these as we want. To actually display them, however, we need to create a new controller, which is just a new PHP file. And this is the name of the folder that we've created here, so the section name. And within this file, if we look at the error page, we can copy this across. So you need to create a class within this file with the same name, which extends the controller. You then need to create a new public function for every individual page that we want to display. So we have an index page and we also have a news page. So this is how we actually build our file structure. So if we go back across to Chrome and reload now, we're going to get our error. If we delete this, we're going to get our home page, which is the same page as index, which is also the same as index.index. We can, however, change this to index.news, which will change across to our news page. If we particularly want to, we could also go directly to the error page. Now this might seem like a lot of work just for a very simple file structure like this, but it will mean that we're able to reuse code very easily, as we talked about at the start of this video, as well as compartmentalizing our code so that within the context that it's intended to be used, it will actually make full and proper sense. One final thing that I didn't mention here is that we will actually need to create new modules if we want to add any logic to our code. And we will do that just by creating a file called, in this case, index_model. So it's just basically the section name _model. And we basically do the exact same thing as with the error model. We just create a new class with the same name as the file, which extends the model. If we want to pass information across between these two, the model and the view, so that we can actually perform some logic, so in this instance we just want to return hi. All we need to do is in our controller, we just need to type this view, and then we'll create a new variable here called test is equal to this model test. And then whenever we're looking at this page within our view, which in this case will be here, we can actually access that information. When we're accessing it from in here, however, we do omit the view part of the line. And so if we refresh this page now, which is our index page, so if we reload this page, we'll see that we get hi being output. Now we do also need to do one more thing. If we go back to our home level directory, you can see that we get this error message. And this is because we're not actually loading the model for the index page at the moment within our Bootstrap, or rather within our controller. Sorry, within our Bootstrap, I was correct. So to correct this, all we need to do is actually load the model. We will do this before we actually move across to the index page. So we can see that this has been corrected now. We'll just format that page. So you can hopefully see now that within the model pages, this is where we actually have all of the logic which goes into our programs. This is often referred to as the business logic of the program. We then have the controller, which actually calls the business logic into action. In this case, we're assigning the output of that logic into the view, so that we can use that output within our view. We can of course call functions within our business logic which we don't pass across, and we can of course pass across data which doesn't come from our actual models. But we'll get into that when we're actually developing our program. After we've called all of the business logic and we're ready to output, we then call the render page. The render then comes across and actually displays whatever's in here. As we've talked about, we can obviously have multiple pages within one section, and depending on the information that we pass across on our business logic, we can have multiple sections within our URL. Our folder structure is completely up to us, and it can be manipulated however we want it to be. When it comes to actually outputting, all we need to do is actually reference the variables that we've created within our controller. In the next section, we're going to demonstrate creating our actual Polymer templates within our MVC framework. I know that we've obviously gone through this quite quickly, and I've not gone into a huge amount of detail into how this works, but hopefully when you see us implementing our Polymer framework within this, it will make more sense. So don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss out. So this time we can obviously still go to team selection, but if we just omit the selection, it will take us to the index page. We can of course create a link directly to the team page as well.